Short is not necessarily bad, just ask women. Bad example. If you're somebody who watches all of my videos, then A, here's a number for online therapy. I don't know what your issue is, I just know that you have one. And B, you probably know that I played 17 games in April and the back end of March, which is insane when you think about it. 41 days, 17 games. I finished a game on average every 2.4 days. I sure am glad I got that electrical engineering degree, considering that's the most complicated equation I've done in a full year. But contrary to what you might be thinking, I wasn't hermited away playing games day and night for 12 hours at a time. There were actually days where I didn't touch games at all and others where I just hopped on for an hour or so. The reason I finished 17 games in that time frame had less to do with me going insano mode and more to do with the fact that I just played a lot of short stuff. Ape Out, Katana Zero, Project Hell, Boomerang X, What Remains of Edith Finch, so many games that could be beaten in 2, 3, 4 hours, and I had a blast doing it. Something new was always around the corner, and I could power through the peaks and valleys of a full creative vision in a single night. It really established something in my head that had kind of been rattling in there for a while, but I feel a lot more comfortable saying now. I kinda don't like long video games. Now, that's a pretty vague statement and kind of a hypocritical one. I've mentioned that some of my favorite games ever are Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and Red Dead Redemption 2, and look at where they clock in at 35, 49, 50 hours. Those are conservative guesses. I can tell you right now that I played Elden Ring for 120 hours before I rolled credits once, and the timing of that is interesting because I played it right before I played the smorgasbord of stuff I did in April. It was back to back. And I gotta say, while I loved game hopping in April and trying out so many new experiences, my time with Elden Ring was maybe my favorite stretch of playing games ever. The excitement, experiencing others playing it, making a bit of content on it too, amazing. So no, I don't hate long video games, but I'm definitely less inclined to pick them up, and unless they blow me away, I harbor a little bit more resentment for them than I would with a shorter experience. I think there's a lot of reasons that some of the biggest games and franchises out there are designed to keep you hooked for long stretches of time, but if we ignore the business side of maintaining interest in battle passes, encouraging players towards a game's microtransactions, and even DLC interest and general mindshare, what we're mainly left with from the consumer end is that these games have a better cost to time ratio, are more likely to make a deeper impact on us, and can present more fleshed out and fully realized worlds and universes. Cost to time ratio is potentially one of the biggest factors in this argument, but it's also the one that I choose to ignore because it's quite frankly impossible to come to a conclusion here. There's just too many variables. I could say, alright, the average movie is a touch over 2 hours long, ticket prices can be all over the place, but again, average $9.16 American, which means that if I'm paying $60 for a game, I should expect over 14 hours of content for it to be equivalent. Look at that, I already used that handy dandy degree again to do grade 7 math. Now, if I did come to that conclusion, I would be known as, I believe the layman's term for it is, a stupid idiot head. A concert can last somewhere between 2 to 4 hours, but you can pay hundreds of dollars just to be sweating near a bunch of dudes in the back row if the performer is Drake. We can't equate these things. And then there's the fact that game pricing makes about as much sense as Tenet on your first viewing. $20 for the 2-hour experience of Boomerang X, $15 for the 25 to 60-hour Hollow Knight, $60 for a game that I religiously played for a month, $60 also for a game that I could beat before I eat my first meal of the day. I'm not saying it's healthy, I'm just saying it's true. And let's not forget the situational changes. Are we buying a 12-hour experience on launch day for full price, or are we saving up for our one allotted monthly game and strategically picking the discounted $15 5-year-old game that'll last us a full year if we wanted? Video game pricing is a serious can of worms that's gonna get us nowhere fast, which is why I spent a full minute explaining why that's the case. What do you mean wasting your time? What I will agree with though is that longer games have more of an opportunity to create the most effective worlds, stories, and lore that'll stick with you for the longest time. It doesn't have to be dozens of hours long. Prey or Outer Wilds can easily be completed in well under a day of playtime, and I'd argue that sometimes effective world building and lore is possible in just a couple of hours. I really dug what Narita Boy did, for example, but if we're talking about the freedom of exploration of Skyrim, the interconnected world of Dark Souls, or the massive playground of GTA, you need more room to breathe, to live in those worlds, to take in the smallest of details. All of these games benefit from being on the longer side, and plenty of longer titles have made their mark on me, but I also think that it's way harder to overlook flaws, way harder to get good pacing, and way harder to even convince myself to start a game once those how long to beat numbers start ticking upwards. Let's hone in on that last thought, not even wanting to start a long game. The bottom line for any game, movie, show, whatever, is that I want it to respect my time. Even if my enjoyment dips at points throughout, as long as it was worth it overall, that's what matters. And obviously it's not as big of a deal if a 3-hour experience doesn't respect my time as it would be if a 30-hour experience doesn't respect my time. That's just numbers. Like most people, I've become pretty aware that game length has being artificially bloated nowadays, which really brings that idea of respecting time into question. A lot of long games spent hours on end setting up the many events and quest types. The first third of some stories, especially in open world games, which tend to be the ones that run the longest, is frequently a flimsy excuse to take you to racing mini-games or the special combat arenas. You know, some of the worst Marvel movies are bad because they feel like they're all set up for future stuff and barely have anything to justify why it's a movie and not an expository text block at the beginning of the next movie. Yeah, some games just do that exact thing for hours or have overly long tutorials. If you're somebody who plays a lot of games, I can guarantee you've played at least one where the tutorial is going on for a few hours, not just like text bubbles are appearing every now and then to give you some laydown on a new ability. No, sometimes you're stuck in a starter arena fighting starter enemies, learning about different boilerplate side objectives for a ridiculous amount of time. And the game might wind up being great eventually after you put in the labor at the beginning, but I can't help but think in that same amount of time I could be having a blast starting and completing a ridiculously fun $5 game on Steam, and once that's done, I can just move on to the next ridiculously fun $5 game on Steam. To me, the slow start of a game is different to a slow burn TV show. Sure, it can still turn me off from watching something if it's taking way too long to get where I want it to go, but in most cases, if I stick with it, I see the reason for the slow beginning. Taking time to learn these characters and their motivations so deeply comes in handy later on, but a lot of the time, a slow start to a game isn't some artistic vision that it pays off later. It's just slow because it's slow. They take forever to get to the meat of everything. The story is expository, the gameplay is expository, the damn visuals are expository. The price of entry to a long game that could eventually grow to be something great always leads me to ask that same question: is this game really respecting my time? Then there's level gating and busy work quests that add very little substance to a game, but do add to the number that a developer can shout out when marketing the title. Remember when the Dying Light devs were like, we have 500 hours of content and your playthrough doing some side quest is gonna take you 100 hours, and people were like, what? And they were like, psych, we were just strategically inflating the ever-living shit out of the numbers because we thought you'd like that. This game is 20 hours long. Okay, thanks. Assassin's Creed is notorious for bumping up their hours by having level requirements for main missions be high enough that players need to engage with a ton of poorly thought out side quests in order to meet them. A lot of JRPGs throw in random encounters, aka fights with no real thought put into them. They're just put there so you can feel like there's more to do. Is this respecting my time? And then there's the issue of, when exactly do I realize a game isn't for me and give up on it? Sometimes even fantastic games with critical acclaim just don't mesh with you. Both Breath of the Wild and Metal Gear Solid for me, at the times that I played them, weren't working. I would never call them bad games, and I know just how sophisticated they are mechanically, but something just wasn't clicking. Who knows though, maybe if I gave them a bit more time, they would have grown on me, but then again, maybe not. In entertainment of all places, that's not a decision that you want to face. A lot of people say, oh, well that's blank hours of my life wasted, and I think that's dumb. You weren't ever gonna do anything valuable with that time. It's wasted no matter what. But if I'm gonna waste time on something, I don't like that I have to vet that thing for hours, potentially being completely bored during the process just to see if it's worth wasting my time on. I'm impatient. Now, I'm gonna say a bit of a weird statement here, but I promise it'll somewhat make sense eventually. I really like okay games. The solid game, the that was pretty good game. Of course, I like great games and basically perfect games more, but those are few and far between. Most of what I play is good, it's solid. Because the average game is an average game. That's how average work. And in almost every way, an average short game is infinitely more enjoyable than an average long game, even a pretty good long game, because there's never any prerequisites before you start enjoying it. A short game can be carried by unique, novel ideas that might not hold enough water to scale up all that well, but they don't have to. The game that I have on screen right now would have no business being the core gameplay loop of a 40-hour epic, but those shortcomings matter less here. Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion is a game where you experience the highest level of catharsis by going around ripping up every important document that's sent your way, whether it's important to you or somebody else. You go around completing basic tasks, finding funny characters, and tearing papers that you definitely shouldn't be tearing. It's great. I think if it was 50 hours, I would want to rip my eyes out, but instead I can just enjoy the simple premise before it overstays its welcome. Flaws in design, gameplay, or structure get on my nerves a lot more when they permeate through a longer experience than when they're presented for a few hours. I don't love the healing system in Boomerang X, but I also kinda don't care. On the other hand, I played Skyrim at my friend's house once and I was not enjoying the gameplay, and when I went home and thought to myself, should I get Skyrim? It's one of the most critically acclaimed games ever and it's got an immense amount of freedom. I was also thinking, yeah, but if the main source of action is something that I really wasn't getting behind is all that other stuff gonna be worth it if I'm playing it for like 100 hours? In the case of The Witcher 3, no, it wasn't. I played that game for 80 hours and I was really digging the story and side quests, but I didn't like the combat at all. It felt off, it felt floaty, it didn't feel impactful, to the point that I turned the game's difficulty down just so I could rip through the fights faster and get to the stuff that I really liked. But man, after 80 hours of never clicking with the combat, I just didn't have the motivation to continue. I never finished The Witcher 3 because its flaws caught up to its greatness for me over time. But then, look at my Trek to Yomi review, same thing, didn't like the combat, liked everything else, turned the difficulty down to get through the fights faster, finished it, thought it was solid. The gameplay was a major gripe that I had, but it never overpowered enough of the experience to ruin it. I've said it before and I'll say it again, anytime somebody says something like the game gets really good after 15, 20, 30 hours, I am immediately shut off from it. I don't care how good it gets eventually, for all I know it might never be my thing, so should I subject myself to a well-known poor stretch of the game just to potentially be disappointed after that point as well? I've heard Skill Up say multiple times that Final Fantasy XIV gets better after like 100 hours, and can I just say, this man is a menace for thinking that's a normal sentence. For years I've wanted a game to convince me about turn-based combat systems, and for years I thought, Persona 5, it's gonna be Persona 5. Everyone says even if you hate turn-based combat, you're gonna love this game. But it's 97 hours, non-completionist, for the base game. Royal's like 20 hours longer. Instead, the game that I did use as an intro to turn-based combat, Inscription. 12 hours. There's so much else that contributes to my preference here. A big one is pacing, both gameplay pacing, but especially story pacing. I dare say I don't think I've played a single game that's over 25 hours long and has a well-paced story. You often get so many stretches where nothing happens, or you forget what's going on, or there's a thin reason for doing things that don't seem all that urgent even though it really should, or things are urgent and you're just ignoring them for now. Rockstar, why Guarma? And why is chapter 6 so goddamn long? Naughty Dog, I was so on board for avenging Joel immediately after he died. I was raring to go kill these dudes, and that's exactly where you wanted me to be. Why are the Ellie sections so stretched out? Abby's sections are well paced because they cut the fat. They knew that when we switched we'd be annoyed, so it was go, go, go mode. Get them on board quick, make them excited quick. But you could have shaved like 5 hours off this game's first half to pace it better. Regardless of what you think about the game overall, I do think most people agree it could have shed some fat. But as many things as I could pick apart, I think ultimately my thoughts are, if I have a choice between a game where I do predominantly the same actions in the same world for dozens of hours versus hopping from a crazy fast-paced shooter to a 2D platformer to a goofy adventure game to an impactful storytelling experience in a fraction of that time, the comparison is only remotely close if that longer experience is something truly, truly great. And the fact of the matter is, that's pretty rare. It's sometimes hard to know whether that's the case at all or not, and even if it is great, if it doesn't click, you feel like your time still wasn't respected. I don't hate long games, but contrary to how they're marketed nowadays, if a game's length is really high and I'm not already on board with the series or creator, it's almost universally a con in my book. But of course, that's just my preference. It's not like long video games are bad. I'm not making that statement, and upon hearing that, or maybe a long time ago, you might have thought, well, then what the hell is the point of this video? Two things. One, to constantly mention the idea of respecting somebody's time, and two, to read out this definition of irony. The expression of one's